I'm Leon Blevins, Professor of Government at El Paso Community College. As you know, I begin some of my programs with short stories and then make the introduction of our special guest. This is a program that's just a conversation with a guest. The little story is this. When I was very young, World War II was going on. I was born in 1937. My father went off to war in 1942. At some point during the war, I came through El Paso either with my mother and sisters or an aunt and uncle and cousins in a car. I made a number of trips, so I couldn't tell you which it was. And at some point, it was either really early in the morning or late at night, and we came through El Paso, Texas, headed toward Los Angeles. And my recollection of El Paso, very first one, is this. I was glued to the window, literally, on the passenger side. I guess we were going down what I now remember was highway number 85, US 85, and it today is called Paisano Drive. And we pass alongside something with all these lights and lots of smoke. And I did not know what it was. And my people in the car, the adults, didn't know exactly what all of it was. But I now know it is known as Smelter Town. A refinery called Asarco was there, and in the middle of the night or the early morning, it was belching out all of this stuff with all these lights hanging from all of these things out there. And as a kid, I was fascinated. Later, as an adult, I ended up living in El Paso and realized what it was. So today, I have a special guest. This is Monica Perales, and she has written a new book about Smelter Town. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I hope I got your name correct. Is that right?
Yes, you did.
All right. And this is what the book looks like.
Yes.
Smelter Town. And so Monica teaches at the University of Houston in the history department.
Yes.
And you're back here for a book signing and kind of a little cheer around to let people know about this part of your history.
Exactly, to get the word out about the book, which certainly reflects a bit of my own history and my family's history, but also the histories of many families in El Paso. There are a number of people who still today have connection to this place, even though it's a place that has been gone for now 30 plus years.
Now, when Asarco closed down, they closed down the copper refinery. I can't remember the exact date. It was around 1999 or something. Right. And I went out there to take some pictures, and as it turned out, one of my students at that time had just lost, a lot of people lost their job, but he was retained as a security guard. And so he let me take a few pictures, nothing that was security-wise. Right. But I got up to take a picture of this plaque that was there and of the smokestack and so on. Why don't you read this plaque that was at Smelter Town at the refinery?
Okay, first smelter in Texas. This building, with its 2-foot thick walls of adobe, was erected in 1887. The first structure of the El Paso smelter of Kansas City Consolidated Smelting and Refining Company. The smelter was founded by Robert Safford Town on March 22, 1887. Originally a lead smelter, chiefly for Mexican ore, the plant was 2 miles from early-day El Paso when it opened on August 29, 1887. It had 250 employees and equipment that included a chimney, 100 feet high, made of wood and lined with thin sheet iron. On April 4, 1899, the Kansas City Company was merged into the American Smelting and Refining Company, now known as Asarco Incorporated.
Okay, a little bit of trouble there. This is sight reading.
Yeah, it is. It is. And some of these I can't tell if they're commas or they're periods.
Right.
So
you did
stumped me a little
fine
bit.
there. We're okay. We're okay with that. And I couldn't have done it because I can't read without my reading glasses on here. But so what I want to do with the first part of this, I notice your book is kind of structured this way. Let's talk about those early days of Smelter Town. And what was the first recollection you had from some of your relatives telling you stories about Smelter Town? Who was the first one that told you a story?
Well, stories about Smelter Town were always a part of my life. Smelter Town had been demolished by the time I was born, but I feel like I grew up with memories of Smelter Town, hand-me-down memories of Smelter Town. These stories were exchanged at family gatherings, holiday events, just across the dinner table and on the porch on, summer afternoons. I think
now that was not here in El Paso. You were born in Tucson?
I was born in Tucson, lived in Phoenix for some time, but my parents were from El Paso, and we spent pretty much all of our holidays here. Spring break, Thanksgiving, Christmas, summer vacation. So we spent a lot of time in El Paso, and we moved back when I was in high school.
Okay.
And so growing up, these stories were very much a part of my memory. I think one of the earliest of the storytellers that I remember was one of my dad's uncles. His name was Jose Lujan. They called him Corona. And I interviewed him for the book, and he was in his 80s by the time I interviewed him, but he always told stories about having grown up in Smelter Town and going to school there and the different activities that the kids were involved in, and he was very much the storyteller. So I think early on, those are some of the memories that I have. But they were memories that are also shaped from a variety of interactions. My mother's father worked at ASARCO for 41 years. He was a machinist, and I remember the kids, the cousins and I playing on the porch waiting for Gramps to come home from work. And every evening after his shift, he'd arrive with his big black lunchbox, and he had cleaned up after his shift in the company bathhouse and came back all nice and dapper. He always wore wingtip shoes.
Did you hear any complaints about how hard the work was, or difficult, or smelly, or anything?
Growing up, I did not. I remember my grandfather wasn't much of a talker. He didn't tell me a lot about his experience, and in some ways, I feel like I came to know him better by doing the research for this book. It was during the interview process where I started talking to people, former employees, many of them had been retired for some time, that I really got a sense for what kind of work was done at the smelter. The grueling labor, the conditions. It was, melting ores at thousands of degrees, right. In the El Paso summer heat, created some pretty unpleasant conditions, to say the least. And so they told me about those experiences, and many of them, on reflecting back on their time at ASARCO, kind of commented, well, the work was hard, but it was good work, and it paid well. And so that was something that was really striking to me about the recollections.
Now, where did you graduate from high school?
I graduated from Coronado High School in 1990.
And then you went to UTEP.
I did. I did my undergraduate degree in journalism at UTEP, and I stayed on and received my master's degree in history at UTEP as well. And that's really where I had always been interested in history, and it was in taking these master's degree classes and working with the faculty there that I really kind of got the idea that I think pursuing a profession as a historian would be something that I'd really enjoy.
We have a program that's produced by the crew that produces this program. It's called Mature Living, and Mary Yanez is the host of that. And she had me on a number of years ago, and we talked about the importance of saving your family history. Mm-hmm. And that's what you have done, basically.
In many ways, yes. It was a very personal project because of the family connections. 3 of my grandparents were born in Smelter Town. One grandparent, she arrived with her family in 1917, and they eventually made their way to Smelter Town, and her father got a job at ASARCO. And so it really was documenting my own family history, but more than that, it really resonated with me because my family story was not unique. I heard from so many other friends and acquaintances and just people around town that they too had these long family histories that were connected to Smelter Town. And so I hope that in kind of exploring my own family's history and exploring that of the community, that it also helps to record the histories of other families.
Well, how hard out was it to do it in this academic way with documenting everything? Mm-hmm. You had pictures in your own family, you had the stories, right. But now you become an academician and you do it in a scholarly way. Tell us how hard that was.
It was, I think what made it the most difficult was finding resources and materials for a place that no longer exists.
Oh, yes.
The archives in many cases were silent. I'd find a piece of evidence and, maybe a newspaper story. I spent a lot of time looking through old newspapers, through any kind of archival collection that might give me a glimpse of the history of the community and of the area, court documents, that type of thing. And I would often find these little nuggets of information. Sometimes they would open up entire avenues of possibilities, and in other cases they were dead ends. And so it was a really difficult process, which is, part of the reason why it took so long. One of the things that I really wanted to do was to get the memories and the stories of the people themselves. And so I did oral history and also mined the oral histories that are available at the Institute for Oral History at UTEP. And many of them had been recorded as well.
And you had some mentors at UTEP that helped you work through all of this stuff.
I did. The faculty at UTEP was wonderful, and they've been incredibly supportive throughout the project in just kind of encouraging me to do this, that yes, that this story is one that is important. It's one that needs to be told. And so I credit many of my mentors at UTEP for helping me down this path.
A number of years ago, my wife Shanna worked with deaf children, and she had one deaf child whose mother, I remember her name was Hoover Ontiveros. I don't know what her maiden name was. But she said she had some newspaper clippings and so on, and she wanted to get them laminated or something and asked if I could help preserve some of those. So I made a little calendar for her here, and we laminated these, and I went out and took some pictures, and they called their little organization Buena Vista Smelter Town Association. So this saved some of those. I noticed you have some of these pictures in your book.
I do, and as a matter of fact, this is my grandmother right here, and her sister is featured on the cover of my book. And I remember also seeing an old photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of the YMCA baseball team as well. So a lot of these are very, very familiar.
And what tends to happen with these newspaper clippings is they start just falling apart.
They do.
And so some people begin to preserve them with lamination. So we want to let people know about this.
Right.
Save your things for children and grandchildren.
Yes, yes. And with the technology that's available today, it's amazing, to be able to scan some of these images and create digital files.
Right.
Everything now is so high tech. But the principle is not. The idea of collecting one's family history and preserving it. I think we often think of archival research, certainly in the historical profession, as being going to a building, a library, and looking through the papers that have been collected by presidents and owners of companies and that type of thing. But families have their own archives,
right?
With photographs and letters and other kinds of pieces of history that are valuable and important.
Well, when my mother died, I inherited about 4,000 pictures.
Wow.
And I actually sent some of those pictures back to the people that had sent them to her because I knew those parts of the family would save them, whereas my part of the family would not.
Right.
And so that's what we needed to be thinking about as historians,
yes,
as people that want to save the past. We have just a couple of more minutes of this segment. We're going to divide this into two parts, looking at the early part of Smelter Town, and then in the second half we want to come back and look at, say, from the 1960s up. Any other things about the early part of Smelter Town you'd want to put in about 1 or 2 minutes?
Yeah. Well, I think that what's important to me, I call the book Smelter Town, Making and Remembering a Southwest Border Community, because it was about these two things. It was about how the workers came to El Paso very shortly after the smelter sets up operation in 1887 and begin to establish a community. They make a community in a way that is meaningful to them.
It was a company town.
It was a company town, but so there were many people who lived in company-owned housing. There were others who set up their own homes, building small little adobe homes along the banks of the river, which was not company property. And so I kind of refer to it as Greater Smelter Town, because there was the sort of the confined company town that, the ASARCO provided the buildings and water connections and that type of thing, a company store, all of the amenities of a company town. But then there was this wider world that expanded below the smelter that was very much a part of it and crucial to the functioning of the smelter.
And your family was a part of it.
Yes.
Well, we want to stop there, take just a brief break, and then we're going to change our little background here. And so we'll return in just 1 minute. Back with the second half of Perspectives El Paso with Monica Perales. Another little story for this segment. In 1964, I registered for some classes the first summer session at a college called Texas Western, now UTEP. I was standing in a line for registering in front of the administration building, and I smelled something that smelled like sulfur. And I asked someone standing there beside me, I said, "What is that? Is that the chemistry building that I smell?" And he said, "No, that is a Sarco." And I said, "Oh, a Sarco, the smelter on the other side of the mountain over here." He said, "That's it exactly." So in some of my earliest days at Texas Western, I smelled a Sarco throughout the day, to be sure. And then related to that, in 1967, my father-in-law, Otis Farr, he notified us he was coming to El Paso, so we invited him to stay with us. And he said he'd been assigned to do a special job. And he came up from Houston. It was either Kellogg Construction or Badger Engineering had sent him as a quality control metal inspector to climb inside this smokestack to the very top, 828 feet, and do the final inspection with his equipment to see if all the welds were made properly. And then when he came back from his inspection over the couple of days, he said that it was a smokestack within a smokestack for circulation and stability, and to keep it from blowing over, they wanted it to withstand at least 100-mile-an-hour wind. So do I have a vivid recollection or what about that smokestack? This is the famous Sarco smokestack that we have as a centerpiece. So Monica, tell us about this part of the story from, say, the 1960s up until now.
Right. Well, my book tries to cover the entirety of Smelter Town's history, from the creation of the community in the 1880s up to its demolition and demise in the 1970s, and even kind of coming up to the present day, sort of how it is that's the remembering part of the book, how and why it is that people remember Smelter Town in different ways and for different purposes. By the mid-century, Sarco was still one of the most prominent employers in town, one of the most prominent industries in town. But a lot had started to change by the 1960s. There was a growing environmental movement. There was a new organization called the Environmental Protection Agency that started to look at, sort of ways of protecting the natural environment, the air, the water. And so I think that the residents of Smelter Town kind of found themselves in this changing setting, as well as the industry itself. And so I look at the air pollution lawsuit that started in 1970 and ended with the discovery of high lead contamination in Smelter Town in the ground, and unfortunately in the bloodstreams of several children who live there, and ultimately the dismantling of Smelter Town.
Did some of your relatives talk to you about losing their jobs and having to move out because of that experience?
My family members had actually moved out earlier. By the time of the lead contamination controversy by the 1970s, a number of families had started to move out. A lot of changes had taken place inside the smelter as well. Following World War II and the success of labor organizing, workers were able to get better jobs and better pay. And so eventually they moved out. They left the homes that they rented in Smelter Town and bought homes in other parts of the city. And so my family was among those, sort of earlier folks who started to branch out of Smelter Town. They still remain very connected by family and kinship and friendship. But other families had continued to stay there. Some of them had been there for generations. Some of the families that are actually still in La Calavera today.
Do you have family members buried there?
I do. Extended, family, cousins who still live there. And they happen to own their property, and so they managed to be able to continue to live there till today. Okay. And so I did talk to people who were living there in the 1960s and 1970s, and also this was a very widely covered story. And so there is a great amount of documentation in the newspapers, as well as legal documents and court records and the records of the City County Health and Environmental District.
You think some of them have in their minds that it was a better place to live than it really was to live?
I think that's the tricky thing about memory, that there's, people selectively remember, they remember good things. We try to forget things that weren't so good, and we try to make sense of them in our own lives. And I think that they chose to remember things that were good about Smelter Town. I think they want to remember the friendships, the connections that they had to the place that were many generations old. And so I don't think that they were just being, that people are just being nostalgic when they think about, Smelter Town. I think there's a little bit of that in there. We all remember the good old days. Things are never quite as good today as they were when we were growing up sometimes. But I think that they also actively remember things because it says something about who they are today and who they and their families were in history.
Mm-hmm. Did you interview the mayor or our state senator or any other public officials with regard to this big battle that was going on?
I did not. I really wanted to focus on the experiences of the people who lived there. I felt that their voices had often not been recorded in the history, and I felt that there was a way to bring in these other voices, sort of the political powers that be, into the narrative. And it certainly had to be there, but my real interest was in writing the history of the people who live there from their point of view. And so that is hopefully what I've done, not to the exclusion of others, but in addition to, so that we can see more of a conversation, what was happening. I think often at the time, and you see this in the newspaper reports from the 1970s, a lot of people who lived in Smelter Town felt that their voices were not being heard. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to, in some small way, try to correct that so that we could understand, where were they coming from, what did they want to see happen?
I know that, well, here we are in early September of 2010. I like to give a date to this so when they show it again in the future, people will know perspective on that. Mm-hmm. And I know that you have some book signings at Barnes & Noble and that you're listed for some sessions with students and professors at UTEP. Tell us about that. Don't you anticipate there'll be some students in those sessions and professors who have relatives that lived in Smelter Town at one time?
I think so. It's really interesting. As a matter of fact, just last week I received a call in my office in Houston, and it was a phone call from a woman. I believe she was calling from Washington State. She left her phone number, and I think the area code was from Washington State. Mm-hmm. And she had come across information about me and my work on Smelter Town, and she said, my great-grandfather lived there in the 1880s, and she had been doing some genealogical research and wanted to talk to me and know a little bit more. And so we had a nice little conversation one morning, and I think that there's a lot of that, people who have that connection, who hear about my work, and so I hope that they do, and I unfortunately couldn't get everybody's story in the book, and so I hope that this is just the beginning of more stories that are written that look at Smelter Town.
You do realize you're now the #1 expert on Smelter Town, don't you?
Yeah. Well,
there's been no academic book written about Smelter Town.
It is.
No family history of this nature about Smelter Town. Aren't you proud of it?
I am. I'm a little bit humbled by it too.
Yes.
Because I just feel like it was a personal interest. It was something that had always been with me, and to have it be published is really a humbling experience.
Yes. Well, you're to be congratulated for it.
Thank
for
you.
All of us here at Community College Television, on their behalf as well as mine, we want to congratulate for that. We have just a few minutes left. Any other things highlights that you want us to know about this particular book?
Well, I think a couple of things are the voices of the people. I think that's something that I really aimed to do, was to not speak for the people who live there or the people that I interviewed, but to allow them to tell the story of Smelter Town in their words. And so I hope that that's something that people will enjoy about the book. And also the photographs. I mean, a lot of them are family photographs. As I mentioned, this is a picture that was in my grandmother's collection, that it was a small, maybe 2x3 snapshot. And that is my great aunt.
Your aunt?
And one of my uncles. We believe that it's my, we think that it's my godfather. He's
really?
My Uncle Jay. Although there's been some back and forth within the family.
Still debating that
Yeah,
one.
like no, we think it's Lencho. No.
That's the reason people need to write on the back of their pictures and tell dates and names.
Exactly. And so there was no date on this particular picture, but Yeah, so there's a lot of really great images that are from my family collection, but also images that people shared with me over time. You know, people heard about what I was doing, and they'd say, you know, I've got some pictures. Would they be helpful to you? And so those are in there as well. So I hope.
Well, I know right now that you have a telephone number and an email or something you can give. In the future, it may be different, of course, in 5 years or something. But why don't you give us an email or a telephone number in case people want to contact you about this?
Well, if people want to contact me, they can use my University of Houston email address, which is mperales3@uh.edu.
That's simple. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's all we're going to give out is an email address, and they can contact you that way.
Seems like that's the best way these days is email.
It's this way, exactly. Any things, poignant stories there? The number one story, besides what you started off with, your very first recollection, one poignant story, just a couple of minutes.
Well, one of the stories, it reminds me of the story that you told about, you know, seeing Smelter Town for the first time and the smokestacks and everything.
The lights.
Yes, I interviewed, he was another great uncle of mine. He talked about living in the company housing up on the plant property. And it was a large family, so it was actually all part of this family, my uncle Angel Lujan. And he said that, you know, it was pretty crowded conditions in the family household. So when his brother Frankie eventually moved off, left, you know, grew up, moved away, he inherited his brother's cot, which was on a little porch that was out in front of the housing. These were row houses with very small porches. And he described there were some vines, some morning glories that were planted that grew up on trellises around the side. And he said, you know, whether it was rain or snow or heat, they slept out there. You know, that was his room. And the one thing that he remembered was in the winter months, when the smelter would pour the slag out of the side, it would warm up his bedroom that was there on the porch. And to me, that was just an extremely poignant story for so many reasons. On the one hand, it reflects the kind of living conditions and the poverty that these families experienced and endured, but also the kind of beautiful memories that people have. You know, the way
on
that
the front porch on the cot.
He says that the warmth of the slag through the morning glories was something that stuck with him.
That's a visual image. So. Well, our time is gone. It went so fast.
It really did. Thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure to have you here. To bring back all of these memories. Some are kind of hard to take, but some are really wonderful memories of family.
Yes.
Thanks for being with me here.
Thank you for having me.
Perspectives El Paso. And thank you, the audience, for tuning in. And watch for another interesting guest on this show. I'm Leon Blevins.